Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you with us this morning. What we wanted to do for the next hour was to have a chance to catch up on a couple of different Brigstow projects. So some of the Seacorn projects that we fund. As I think many of you know, Brigstow is one of the research institutes at the University of Bristol. Our focus is really on trying to bring people together from very different disciplinary backgrounds and very different kinds of knowledge, whether that be lived knowledge or more academic knowledge, to ask big questions. And the big questions that the projects are asking that we'll be thinking about today are really about our senses and how we perceive environmental change, from the ways that individuals experience temperature extremes and how that informs our perception of climate risk, to the sounds of the city and how that impacts upon our well-being. What we'll do is we'll have a chance to have an update from both teams, and then some very brief questions after that, and then a larger time for questions and discussion right at the end. We are recording this, so just be aware of that. I guess, if you'd prefer not to ever appear on this, please make sure your camera's switched off. And when you ask a question, you might want to ask that through chat. So feel free to pop a question into the chat and I can just read that out to the teams. Or if you're happy to ask a question in person, then just raise your hand during the question and answer period, and I'll invite you to offer that question. There's a live transcript that's available. So just down at the bottom of the screen, if you click on CC live transcript, then you'll be able to pull up a live transcript of everything that's going on. But I think what we should do is introduce the first team. So it's a team led by Alan Kennedy-Asser from the Geography Department at the University of Bristol. Temperature Life Stories, Feeling the Heat. So welcome, Temperature Life Stories. And maybe you could start off by telling us a little bit about your research project. And I don't know who wants to start with that. Maybe Alan, you might want to start with that. And in particular, I guess what we'd be interested in knowing is what's the central research question that you've been exploring and asking.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. You've already given a very, very brief kind of idea of what the project's about, but more or less, we were interested in looking at the kind of crossover between quantitative scientific climate data about temperature and what people as individuals actually feel and experience, because what might feel like an extreme temperature for me might feel very different to everybody here who's in the room and everyone else in Bristol and around the world. So the idea was to bring together this quantitative scientific data in the form of making like a personalized temperature graph for each participant that we worked with, and then contrasting that against poetry and memories and stories that people told about their own experience of temperature through their lives. So Caleb Parkin, who's on the call here, facilitated our poetry workshops, which we held both online and in Windmill Hill City Farm, to start to explore, as I say, how people feel temperature and why it feels different to different people.
Could you tell us a little bit about what you've discovered, and maybe kind of invite Alan to start, but maybe other members of the team to talk about that kind of process. So as you, in a sense, thought about this sort of personalizing of the experience of temperature rise, what did you discover? And I mean, I don't know how expected or unexpected those discoveries were, or maybe you went into this genuinely not knowing what the experience would be like, how people would respond.
Yeah, so I guess one of the things I think I can kind of speak on behalf of a lot of the team here, we were quite surprised at like how creative and how diverse people's ways of expressing their experiences and their memories and their stories could be. So we always wanted to kind of, although there were poetry workshops, we wanted to have the option for people to use more creative forms to sort of tell their story. And I personally was totally kind of blown away by it. It was nice that I think we had about 20 participants, more or less, in our workshops, and some of them did kind of stick to what I had sort of envisaged at the start of the project. Like, you know, they wrote a poem, they reflected on their graph, and the two sit side by side, and that's quite nice. But some of them really went off piste, and that was really exciting for me because, you know, my background is climate science, and it seems very much like we know the analysis that we're going to do before we set off, and we make some graphs at the end and write a relatively boring paper about it. And to see all this mad creative stuff come out was, really, really exciting. And yeah, I suppose with only 20 people, there's definitely an awful lot more experiences of temperatures out there. So I don't feel like I suddenly now understand how all humans experience temperature, but it was definitely a very interesting insight to see how people unlike myself would interact with this data and understand, or maybe not understand, temperature data. So I don't know if anyone else from our team would like to add a wee bit there.
Cliff, let's bring Cliff in to say a bit more about that.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks, Alan. I was also had the privilege of being part of this project and participating in some of the workshops. And I have a background as creative researcher, arts-based researcher. And I have to say that the project went, well, it might have been like that classic picture of the duck on top and the legs underneath going really quickly under the water, but it was very successful and ran very smoothly. But one of the key confirmations for me was how often when we look at data, we think of data as out there in the world, and then we go out, we find it, we bring it back in. And what this project and what Alan and Caleb have done is demonstrated quite clearly that data is made, data is created, and our methodology helps create that data to give it a life, to make it, to allow it to come from the people and be created with the people and the community. So I thought that idea of data being made as opposed to just being out there found, pinned down, because it's messy and it changes and some things slip through the gaps. And that's a great thing about poetry. It's open enough to allow this diversity of interpretation rather than this strict objective data that you would just say, here is what temperature is. And also the other takeaway that I had was, and it was really interesting for me, I've been working with a number of engineers and they keep treating arts-based research as this idea that it's communication. They have the data, they have the findings. Arts-based research then becomes this communication tool. And this, what we demonstrate is the whole process that we went through and that Alan and Caleb led was that no, creative research is the methodology, it's the data, it's there in creating the research question. It goes the whole way through. It's not just the add-on at the end. And this was beautifully demonstrated throughout the project. And I think as one of the workshop participants, it also demonstrated to me how the methodology is a learning opportunity, right? So it's a pedagogy. So when you participate in these projects, I was watching and learning from other people about their expression, about what temperature means to them. And we're all learning together. It's not like we get to the end, here's the paper. That was the learning experience. No, the learning experience was the actual doing of the project, which I think was really valuable. So anyway, that was just my takeaway of watching the project unfold and leadership of Alan and Caleb.
Caleb, could I maybe bring you in at this point to kind of, so in a sense, like Cliff said, that often we don't think of poetry as data, that we think of poetry as something else. And maybe you could say a little bit more about the kind of methods that you deployed or the ways that you, and I guess what you learnt from thinking about poetry as a way of doing something about something that feels very quantitative. This idea of kind of temperature feels like this kind of fixed data point that you can measure on a graph, and yet you were using poetry in some ways to kind of get beneath that or explore that. And maybe you could say a little bit about that process and also what you felt like you learned from that from participants.
Absolutely, yeah. I've worked with scientists of different disciplines before and actually find that the kind of messy space of how do we feel about the data or how did we experience the data or those kinds of things are really interesting questions to kind of muddy the waters of what's seen as objective data. And what so we did some activities. There's this one called How I Knew Harold, which is a process of recovering fugitive memories and asked people to kind of remember times they've been extremely hot or very cold or experienced extreme temperatures, and then kind of track that against the data to see, how reliable our memories are, but also how it sits against the data. We talked about what colour temperatures were, and then looked at some colour poems. So that kind of subjective sense of, well, how hot is red actually, because blue actually is a hotter flame, and this kind of thing. So tracking our perception and what's encoded culturally as temperature, as hot, as cold, and then, you know, what goes into popular culture and our kind of idioms and that kind of thing. And also, I think what was really fun was the stuff we kind of put people in dialogue with their graphs through like an interview with their graph. They interviewed the graphs to get a sense of how they feel about the data, and also graph jamming, which is really where a lot of the group's creativity came in, where we asked them to put their graph together with something else. And we ended up with a piece of piano music based on the data. We ended up with like an aerial performance proposal. And yeah, I think everyone was really blown away just by the creativity, because we'd left a big space for the participants to bring what they had around and put it together, smoosh it together with the graphs and see what happened, which was tremendously rewarding and exciting.
Maybe Alan or Cassie or Kirk, we could bring you in at this point about your own reflections about this. Really, I think what's so interesting about the project is the way that you are really kind of challenging us to think differently about data, and in particular about climate science data. What are your own reflections, I guess, about the ways in which you think differently about data as a result of undertaking this really, like, a kind of extraordinarily interesting creative experiment, in a sense, with a bunch of people? Kirk.
Yeah, sure. I can jump in on that really quickly. And just to say that it was a pleasure to be part of this project. I was jumping on and off because I was on research leave, so I was sort of coming in and out. But it was really great to sort of see how Alan and Caleb were pulling this together. And for me, I guess it would be almost to echo what Clifton and Caleb had said about this idea of encoding, and that story and that narrative making is a form of encoding knowledge in and of itself. That it is a form of data production, and more importantly, I think it's a site of knowledge production, which is, again, as Clifton said, not necessarily where it sits in the kind of larger kind of academic or intellectual landscape, right? We sort of see scientific production over here, and that narrative or story or poetry or creative production generally is a conveyance of that information, right? It's a medium, as opposed to a site where experience over time is sort of distilled and put into these sort of narrative forms. And we can sort of track that, you know, morphologically maybe, and say that as narratives change, that might be a reflection of how the environment is sort of coming up against people's cultural practices. And that site, that sort of nexus, seems to be a really interesting data point, I suppose, for lack of a better way to put that. And that, for me, it changed my idea about, well, I think I'd already been working at this, but it changed. So I knew that storytelling could do this, but I think that for me, it actually changed my idea about data. I think I like the idea of data more. I'm a literary scholar, and so you know, these kinds of graphs are the furthest thing from my mind most days. But I think, like, looking at what we did in some of the workshops, I participated in one of the workshops, and looking at what we did with graphs and data, I was actually really intrigued. I found this to be another place where I could come with my sort of narrative way of thinking about things, and intervene and interact and engage in a meaningful way, in a way that I normally look at a graph and I sort of run in the other direction. And so I thought that this was a really nice way to be able to sort of engage at that intersection between data and story.
I'd also just like to jump in with another thing, which I feel like I've taken and learned from this project was, I suppose I'm not surprised by this conclusion. It's kind of the motivation was this idea that you know, we all have experienced the temperature differently, or, you know, feel uncomfortable at certain temperatures or other. But at the end of the day, when I go back to my sort of day job doing sort of climate risk modeling, like, I know all of that's there, but still somehow we just say, like, oh, well, if it's above 25 degrees Celsius, then all of a sudden it's bad. Like, if it's 24.9, it's okay. But if it's 25.1 degrees Celsius, it's bad. You know, to see how, and to have some actually nice, clear examples of how these sort of thresholds don't make sense in the real world for an individual was really nice. And there's just a few examples I can think of. So when I was making these life graphs for people, which included the temperature where they'd lived every day of their life, I did ask people, like, look closely at this, make sure there's no mistakes, because I was kind of doing it late at night, putting these graphs together, like make sure it's roughly the right length for the length of your life, whatever. And there was someone said, oh, I can't see my trip to, I can't remember, was it Australia or Southeast Asia somewhere on my graph. I was expecting to see a big spike in temperature. Why is it not there? And actually, when I zoomed right in and looked at the graph, they traveled there in December. So for them, coming out of the UK in winter, it felt so hot, and it really stuck out in their head as the significant time in their life when it felt so hot. But actually, when December temperatures where they had gone were pretty similar to summer temperatures in the UK where they'd been living before. So actually, when you zoomed in close to the graph, it just kind of stayed the same, and it didn't look that abnormal. And so, I think there's a lot to be said about where people travel through their lives. And I guess there must be something to do with, you kind of can mentally prepare yourself sometimes for a holiday. Maybe if you go somewhere hot, you could probably quite comfortably sit on a beach in Spain and 35 degrees and think this is great. Whereas if you're in 35 degrees in a top floor flat in Bristol trying to concentrate on your work, it could be the worst thing in the world. So yeah, it was just quite nice for me to get some real examples of that.
Caleb.
Just to continue that thought, with the How I Knew Harold activity, part of that was about unreliable narrators, and we talked about that a little in terms of data. And actually, is data, data isn't always objectively deployed, as we've seen various times, all the time, especially over the last few years. But yeah, so that was a really interesting process to kind of say, okay, well, actually, there's a narrator of data, the data narrator, and so to be critical about that and to kind of start gaining a criticality about data, even if you're not very good at it, as I don't feel like I am as well, coming from the literary arts side. But actually, I did an MSc where we talked about poetry as data, and it was very uncomfortable for me, actually. But I'm really glad that I've had that muddling experience, and it's continued through this process too. Yeah, and actually, I wanted to say as well that two of the participants ended up making a Poetry Society resource with me as well around coral bleaching. Because they asked me to do something, and so we had a comedy improviser and a marine biologist, and so we ended up working together on that. So this kind of interdisciplinarity is kind of continued, which is very pleasing to see. So yeah.
Cassie, it'd be great to bring you in to the conversation, and maybe to hear a little bit of your reflections on kind of the experience, especially the experience of being part of this really radically interdisciplinary team. What it brought to your own thinking about your own discipline and your own sense of interdisciplinarity.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I would echo everything that's been said already, and also thank Caleb and Alan for, allowing me to be involved. I really enjoyed it, and I think we've all individually learned so much on the journey. For me, I think what was really crucial were those creative exercises that Caleb did as part of the workshops, of sort of poking fun at graphs. I mean, I really appreciated that. I'll read a quantitative paper, maybe something Alan's been an author on, and sort of skip through the pages with all the graphs on, and then, sort of read the top and bottom. But it made it immediately sort of less daunting, and chopping them up and interviewing your graph. These are all sorts of things I've never considered doing before. And I just found it incredibly freeing. And I think that set the tone then for the rest of the workshops as well. But equally, I wanted to just comment on the process of working together as a group from the very get-go. I thought Alan and Caleb set the tone really well. Just, Alan would inevitably make a comment on the weather, usually send a picture of his dog. I think we saw a picture of his dog eating an ice cream, and Caleb set up a playlist on Spotify for us to sort of drop some tunes in relating to heat. So there were these kind of informal activities going on around the project as well, which I don't think they were insignificant. I think they were actually really important for just sort of setting the tone and encouraging creativity, which for me, I'm not adverse to it at all, but I think it takes a while to just sort of come out of your box a little bit and engage in that way. And that was really helpful. So yeah, really positive experience. And I learned so much, and sort of thinking of little nuggets to take forward into future projects as well.
Maybe I could just ask a bit about that kind of process, Caleb. Obviously, this was, I think, all done in a context of lockdown and COVID, that pretty much the entire project ran through that. How did you're someone who's really experienced at doing poetry workshops, so it's kind of part of your bread and butter. But maybe could you say a little bit about how you kind of adapted that and what you felt like you learned about the possibilities of these kinds of Zoom virtual fora for doing that kind of work?
Yeah, I think, these terms like blendedness or blended or hybrid and everything are being chucked around a lot, but actually they can mean a great many different things. And so I felt like we wanted to try some of that with this project. And Alan brought his music recording experience to bear brilliantly in doing the technology for a blended session. So the first session was blended. And then we gave people the option of coming online or in person. And actually, sometimes people did move between those two in the middle, which was nice. They actually kind of decided to come to the online one because of logistics or childcare or whatever else. So that was interesting to kind of experiment with what blended could mean. In terms of the tech, when you're doing it in the room, you've got some people at home and then you've got some people in the room. There's a lot to think about. And I think what I felt was that there really needs to be investment in that. There needs to be maybe for different kinds of organizations, especially arts organizations, from my perspective, who don't always have tech resources, is investment in skills and kit and advice on the ways that people could make that happen. Because I think it could be a brilliant thing, and it worked, largely in part to that brilliant technology. And also we'd really thought it through in terms of the staging. And I hope that people at home really felt included and could see everyone in the room and all the rest of it. But, it's like an outside broadcast. It's a huge amount to consider, and also to try and field both online and in person at the same time. But I was really pleased with the way that we collaborated to make that work. And then actually we did the option of one-to-ones either in person or via Zoom, and just kind of situated ourselves somewhere. So I think it was a good start to really making proper use of this technology, which can be brilliant, but needs thinking through till we're all properly literate in it, is my sense.
And can I just really,
Alan, yeah.
Add a really quick note. The others have mentioned, Caleb and for facilitating himself, for helping run the workshops sort of in person, but the rest of the team really did take quite an important role, as we called, what was our word? Digital envoys, I think we like to call people, just people who knew what was coming up. And Cassie was always in charge of like setting up breakout rooms, because it's enough to juggle when you're in person, trying to switch between microphones and webcams to look at the room or look at the speaker and make sure the slides are in the right place. If I had to do breakout rooms as well, my head would have exploded. So, it really was a team effort in that regard.
And Alan, I think that's the thing with the kind of resourcing, is also people. To do a session like this, you really need like 4 of you, 2 in the room, 2 online. It's a lot to do, because if you imagine like the BBC does an outside broadcast, they have a whole team that comes in often to do that. So yeah.
Can we do a quick fire, just final word from each of you? Just one thing you felt like you learnt through this experience, through the process, just one kind of piece of learning. Cliff, can we start with you? You already talked a little bit about that. Anything that kind of stands out as something that you kind of take away from working together?
Well, in terms of working together, it's just the classic process of listening to each other. But in terms of the project, trusting in, like treating the community as experts, participants as experts, as much as the people who are part of this process. So, normally we have a hierarchy of experts, but let's do away with that. I think that's important.
Kirk?
Just back to the idea that there's a whole mess of stories inside any kind of plot that you put on a graph. You can explode that open and find quite a bit inside.
Cassie?
Well, Cliff took my trust word. That I was going to say that, but I think also kind of learning on the job and perhaps not being afraid of that. And I think these sort of schemes, the support from Brigstow to enable researchers to learn on the job and experiment in this way is just really, really valuable.
Caleb?
I think celebrating how surprising a co-produced group can be and what they'll bring. If you say, what other skills have you got? And they go, by the way, I do this. And you're like, whoa, okay. So yeah, allowing that surprise and celebrating it.
Which I think is really interesting, because often people have a very kind of narrow job title, don't they? But a whole set of stuff underneath that, which can be brought to the fore in these kinds of projects. Probably that leads us to Alan, doesn't it? Who has a job title, but a whole lot of other stuff beneath that. Alan, one bit of learning.
I think I would like to do something like this again. I feel like it really added a lot of texture to my own research for all, I'm not going to quit being a scientist. I think that's really important, but having this alongside it, I think really complemented the work well. So, I could see myself doing interdisciplinary work in the future and trying to like write that into proposals slightly more formally in the future. So that's a personal learning for me.
Great. Thank you so much, all of you. There was a question that came in from Rosanna, which has been answered. Rosanna was asking about if there's any outputs to show for the project, and apparently it's coming soon. So there's an online exhibition of poetry and graphs from the project. They'll be coming soon. So we'll make sure that people know about that. What we'll do is let's move straight to the next project, I think, and then we'll have time at the end for some questions and answers, and do keep them coming through in the chat, and again feel free to respond to stuff in the chat as well, so please use that. Caleb says the online exhibition is looking wonderful, so I think that's a teaser there for us to look out for that. What would be great to do is to move to Pete and Josh and Jameson and Sabina. And maybe to ask you, kind of just start off with the same sort of question, really. It'd be great to get a feel for, I think Josh and Pete, you're going to respond to this, of just a little bit about what the research project entailed. And in particular, what was the kind of core central question, I guess, that you guys were trying to answer?
Sure. We had two central questions to our project. Those were, how does city sounds affect your mood? And what would you need to do to modify a city soundscape to increase that mood from something negative to something positive? The project was brought together through a discussion actually with Jameson at the beginning. We had the idea, if you could change the sound of an air conditioning unit into something less of a penetrating hum, into a more tuned sound that's a bit more palatable. And
yeah, and I guess I can jump in there. Basically, we speaking to Jameson about the projects early on. We just had this idea that what if we could? It's a crazy idea. What if we build instruments for buildings to play to modify the sonic environment? So we had this first meeting where I hadn't met Jameson before. Josh put us in touch, and somehow we both arrived at the same idea of panpipes for buildings. Like what would that look like? And this came from Jameson's work as an acoustician and my background in building musical instruments for people. The basis of the project was, how can we use this to create a positive change in the environment? So we were not interested in just noise pollution and reducing noise, which is maybe the one of the steps you could take, but what happens when you change the sonic environment? And that's something, looking around, we hadn't seen quite as much sort of done in the research or other projects like this. And then I guess, so pointing out is the outcome of this was a sonic trail. So we'll go into most later, but we did move away from the building giant instruments for buildings to play, and it kind of went into a sonic trail where we explored the ideas that people could walk around Spike Island and listen to possible ways to modify the sonic environment.
So we should bring Jameson in at this point, shouldn't we? And Sabina as well. And maybe Jameson and Sabina, you could tell us a little bit more about what you discovered. We were really hoping for buildings that played panpipes, but what did you discover when you shifted focus a little bit? But I guess keeping this ideas at the heart, which is not to think primarily as urban spaces as kind of sites of noise pollution, but actually almost a kind of much more positive rendering of urban sound. I don't know who wants to kick off, Jameson or Sabina, to let us know a little bit about what you discovered. I think Jameson's going first, and then Sabina. Great.
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to go first. I'm sure Sabina can interject as and when. I think looking at it, the idea was, I suppose, quite grand and abstract in the beginning, and then we did experiment. It's on our research page, with creating these physical instruments, you can say, using plate reverb, and looking at history, looking at an Aeolian harp and things like this. But I think as we also try to bear in mind that we're trying to capture the perception of the public, how to actually do that in the context of a city during COVID, we had to be a bit clever and thoughtful. So the idea evolved from that. We experimented with their building instruments physically, but then also because we always wanted to have like a sound walk or sonic trail. And we concluded that it would be more straightforward to do that in a more digital way. So there's a platform by which you can carry out somewhat of an augmented sound walk, through which we were able to render different sounds and present them to the public. And I think as a whole, that concept or that realization that you can interpret or try to imagine a future soundscape which would ideally have physical instruments but do it through that virtual step, what was a useful thing to test and to carry out, because coming from an acoustics background, it's good and straightforward to have a number, the decibel by which you can conclude your assessment with a threshold. But how do you actually go about changing the soundscape and then understanding the public perception without just creating what you want to create? So I think overall that was something that we started looking to ensemble across through this project.
And maybe Sabina, I could ask you from your perspective, what did you kind of get from people that were involved in this project, like people that were kind of in a sense testing this out? Like what are people's perceptions of urban sound, or of what people want within urban space, of how they listen, I guess, to urban space?
Yeah, a lot of surprises. We did deep listening exercises, and basically if I just want to kind of shorten, what we find was just a long list of unexpected reactions. It wasn't at all straightforward whether it was an unpleasant sound and people had an unpleasant reaction to it. A lot of people experienced and interpreted this unpleasant sound in a lot of different positive ways, as positive distraction, or even relaxation, or excitement, or even safety. So just the reactions were really, really diverse. Yes, that's
just, I guess with that finding, is it possible to create urban spaces that sound, I mean, I guess how do you kind of create urban spaces that have that sense of sounding different for all of us, or that we kind of each find the places that sound good? Or, you know, how does that work, do you reckon, in terms of thinking about urban space and planning and architecture, which I know is one of the things that you really went into this thinking about as a project team? You were really interested in thinking about architecture and how architecture could be kind of sound not just look good, but sound good as well.
I answered quickly, but then I let the team members as well to add. Two things from my perspective is there are certain things that influence the soundscape that you can't escape. So if something is noisy or annoying and you have a positive reaction to it, if you spend a really, like a really long time in it, or it's really, really loud. So if you kind of move that to the extreme end, to the experience, then you can't escape it. It's not going to be a pleasant sound for like 24 hours, listening to, I don't know, the traffic. But also the co-production comes in here, is that it's not just the experience of the sound, it's making sense of the soundscape. So to make any change or intervention, co-production becomes crucial. Jameson?
Yes, no, I would agree. Just need to be refreshed on the question, sorry.
Just in terms of the sense, Jameson, of you're really interested in acoustic design. What do you think you took away from the kind of learning about how acoustic design can work for these very diverse experiences of urban space? One of the things that you found was that actually people hear very differently, different sounds sound very different for different people. In the same way, I guess the first team found that temperature feels very different for different people. The kind of homogeneity of a graph actually has a kind of very different experiential sense. And I guess you guys found that as well from the research you were doing. How do you design buildings for everyone, cities for everyone?
Yeah, so I think what it will be as well, because of course there was a bit of a, I can say chronologically, we initially started carrying out sound walks around the city just with ourselves, and of course we collaborated with Bristol Sound Walks run by Lansmith Associates. By doing that, we went to places that I think initially we thought were palatable, calm, and we just asked the public what they thought about the space. What is sound? What is sound here? And these initial sound walk interview steps allowed us to gauge and get an idea of how people would perceive particular sounds. So for example, Queen Square compared to Colston Avenue, for example. That being said, in order to actually do that in terms of design, you'd probably go to, well, looking at how things are usually done, you'd establish a baseline. So Spike Island, actually, there is an article that Sabina had written about the existing perceived soundscape over Spike Island, different parts of the island. So in essence, that is what you try to do. You try to find an unbiased way of collecting that perceptual data, either by interviewing people or giving them a questionnaire. We decided to do interviews that was perceived as more, thought to be more, less biased, sorry. And then from there, you can, I think, decode that. You can code and decode that data. I think Sabine can explain it better than I can. And then you can get those keywords that will relate to the perceived soundscape in an area. And then from there, if you can perhaps see that there are more negative words associated with a particular location, then perhaps when you're looking at the future design, you can say, okay, this particular intervention may be able to alleviate or massage these negatively felt emotions in this space. That would be the bare bones, I think.
Yeah.
I think that's what
I love this idea of sound interventions, of kind of almost like thinking about how a city sounds and then thinking about how a city might sound, which I think is at the kind of core of the project, isn't it? And was right at that beginning where you were thinking a little bit about panpipes and buildings that might play the panpipes. Maybe Josh and Pete, could we just get a sense of your own reflections on the sort of interdisciplinarity and especially the co-produced side of this project? It's something that Sabina mentioned, that one thing that you were really interested in thinking was about how co-production would be at the heart of this work, and that it would be, in a sense, treating everyone as an expert of what a city sounds like. What's your own reflections of working in interdisciplinary and co-produced ways? Maybe Pete first, and then over to Josh, who we hear but we don't see.
Great. So I'd like to say that it was I've been in quite a few interdisciplinary projects, and this one I can clearly say it was the most kind of level interdisciplinary experience I've had. And there was a few. I was just jotting out a few reasons why I think that works. So there's a question in the chat. So how we actually did the working, and one of the things we did was we were focused on a very particular geographical place. We decided quite quickly on Spike Island, and we ended up having our meetings in the place we were researching. So that immediately helped really ground things. So we weren't Skyping and we were going for a walk, especially given this was just after lockdown. Still walking was quite a new enjoyable thing. And so we went to the actual place. We had room, we gave license for everyone to explore and to fail with ideas. So if someone had an idea, no matter how light it was or quick, we'd say go and do that, capture it, document it, and we had a clear process for that, which was putting it on our website, which I put the link to before. The other thing that we really helped in the second half of the project was having a clear goal. So we had the Hidden Bristol app, the Bristol Open Doors Sound Walk, and having that clear goal took this really divergent thinking process that was documented in the website and really converged it quite rapidly into a 1 hour experience. And that again gave everyone a chance to be involved across the board. And at no point we ever had one person handing off to another. It was very much everyone was mucking in and working simultaneously. I don't know if Josh wants to jump in.
You want to add about that, about the kind of process of working in an interdisciplinary and a kind of co-produced way?
Sorry, Tim.
Josh, I was going to see if Josh. Josh, if you wanted to add anything about that kind of way of working, and Rosanna's asked a question in the chat about that, about the kind of how of interdisciplinarity and of co-produced research.
Sorry, my internet connection is dropping in now. I heard that there was a question. Many apologies.
Yeah. Josh, any reflections on the kind of how-to of co-produced and interdisciplinary research? What do you feel like you kind of learnt about doing interdisciplinary and co-produced projects?
I think compared to an engineer, so my background is engineering, so it was a lot more hands-off, I think. So more exploration-based rather than hypothesis-based, which was a bit different for me. Working with the artists and coming up with the idea, that was a very different process rather. The project before was
I think we might have just lost you, Josh, unfortunately. We'll see if we can come back to you in a minute. Maybe, Sabina, I could turn to you. Anything that you think, so you're someone who in a sense has worked in this area before. What do you feel this project has added to your kind of previous research and to your own discipline? Maybe say a little bit about your own disciplinary background and what you feel like working in this kind of this broader group has brought to your own sense of yourself as having a particular discipline and approach.
Mm-hmm. So I'm a research student in film at the moment, but I have a background in social science. So all I'm coming from is visual methodology, and social theory, social science. So I was the one person, I think, who didn't have sound as a central concept in the project. So for me, one of the things from an interdisciplinary perspective was very interesting that I wanted to understand the people I work with. I wanted to understand how they think with, what is this sound that they are thinking with, why is this so important for them? I tried to take that really seriously, and linked to that is how I understood my own experience, but how do people communicate this experience, sound? How do we go out and talk to people which is kind of linked back to the previous project for creative expressions. How do we help people to express their experience in sound? Because I'm studying green placemaking, it also links to my research, is how do you have the experience with people, or how do you observe people, or how do you understand the experience of people through this research communication? So how is this kind of transfer of meaning and understanding happens? So for me, that was the most interesting. And this is also quickly just replying to one of the questions I just put in the chat, what deep listening was like, or what it is. It is basically, put it shortly, it's letting people experiencing the soundscape and then giving them space or opportunity to express that experience. So for us, it looked like we recorded silence and the soundscape for 1 minute. We gave them this 1 minute to listen to and experience the sound, and then we asked them questions about the experience. So I'm finishing this sentence now. Basically, they found ways to talk about it. The words they used, the expressions, it was very interesting. There were like some really sounds that really deeply and immediately impacted people, that you saw their entire body reacted to it. So kind of interpreting and understanding this expression and this communication through the body, but also through the vocabulary, was something important for me, and is something that I will use in my research in the future.
That's great. And I guess that's sort of back to why, in a sense, like Jameson was saying, you didn't want to just use questionnaires, but you wanted to use interviews, but in a sense, not just to think about what people said, but also how they reacted, and in almost like participant observation, to watch their bodies and think about them as kind of much more bodied.
Yes, and share that movement with them.
For sure. And when we also have a duty as researchers, when you give someone a questionnaire, questionnaires are incredibly boring. And I think that's a big piece of going out and speaking to the public, especially as researchers. We're pretty guilty about being boring quite a lot of the time when we throw surveys out, but to actually turn it into a conversation, or to even ask people what it means, and you get a lot more depth to your response. There was a big parallel when I was working in air quality, which is something you can measure technically, a bit like sound. But the research has sort of moved on. The air quality in a lot of cities in the UK is too high, too much pollution. That's fine, that science is finished. It's how we lower it or how we diagnose it by asking people, like, what does this sound mean to you? Is it nice or bad? What do you think caused this air pollution? You kind of put the research into other people's hands as well to try and get some of the solutions out of it you can then go and use and solve it.
Let's finish off by asking, it'd be great for all of you just to kind of offer a kind of sort of quick reflection. And just one thing that you feel like you kind of learned personally from being involved in this project team. Maybe Sabina, do you mind if I start with you? Just a kind of sense of what you kind of take away from this as a kind of, you know, individually, as a researcher, as a person, what kind of sticks with you in being involved in this project?
There is actually a lot that we learned from each other, I think, and also in the process. It was a really exciting project. Really enjoyed it. But I also think about interdisciplinarity. I do want to do interdisciplinary research as much as I can in my work. And for me, this kind of merging or not merging, or how you negotiate the participation of the different disciplines, that was extraordinarily interesting. I mean, what I learned, and it's not something I discovered, but I think it's interdisciplinary research. It's there all the time. Is to ask the questions in an interdisciplinary way already. It's critical, but also how the complexity of a discipline that we brought with us, and this kind of life words that we shared with each other, that was extremely exciting.
Jameson, any kind of reflections on what you feel like working, you know, because it's so striking, both of these teams are like unbelievably interdisciplinary, that people are coming from everything from arts through social sciences into engineering to very applied disciplines to hard science. Yeah, I mean, there's like an incredible range. What did you kind of take away, Jameson, as a, you know, your own sense of kind of learning from that process?
Yeah, I suppose, whilst I very much enjoy my day-to-day as an acoustic consultant, I do have an interest in research and art and music, and it was great to be involved, to get stuck in, but also to learn very quickly better ways to communicate, rather than coming up with a whole list of ideas and pushing them forward. It's always better to ask for opinions, ask for help, and to learn in that way. And yeah, it's great to have a great team of people that have a range of experience in research and to learn just those softer skills and those methods, because very much at the end of the day, it is about that, in my opinion.
Great, thanks. And Pete.
Yeah, so I thought at this point I'd like to acknowledge as well, we brought 3 independent sonic artists, Kathy Hine, Dan Pollard and Dan Meckin, on board, who are integral to the projects. And I learned a lot from them and from Einol, the team member who unfortunately couldn't make it today, just in their own techniques of sound manipulation. But the one thing that really stood out that I was not expecting was learning how to use an angle grinder and beat sheet metal with Josh in my garage, trying to craft large metal sculptures. We had no idea about that before we started the project. So that was a good moment of interdisciplinary coming together. Yeah.
And Josh, finish up with you. What do you feel like you learned from working together with these guys?
I'll pick up on both what Pete and Sabina said, the teaching the heavier engineering stuff, but it was also, we got a lot out of explaining complicated terms from each of our fields, because a lot of us didn't have any background at all in some of the terms we were using, so we always had to go back and explain them. But that also made us question it again, like think of it from different points of view. And sometimes that question came from another person in the team, which was something you might take as granted. Just to ask it in a different way repeatedly is incredibly useful, and it's something I took a lot away from.
Great. Maybe what we could please do put questions in the chat or raise your hand if you want to ask a question. I know there's a whole set of questions coming in about doing interdisciplinarity. And Rosanna's asked a really interesting question about, I wonder how, and capitalized HOW, colleagues did the interdisciplinary working. Did you set up some process? Did someone coordinate? I'd like to hear experience from both projects. And we had a little bit of that now from Pete and Josh and Sabina and Jameson. Alan and Caleb and Kirk and Cassie, any comments on that sense of the kind of nuts and bolts of doing interdisciplinary research? Because I think for all of us listening, the thing that really stands out for us is how really radically interdisciplinary both of these project teams are. And I guess a lot of us have questions about, well, how, if we wanted to experiment with that, how would we make it work? Alan, Caleb, Cassie, let's start off with you. Any reflections on that? How to be better interdisciplinary researchers?
Yeah, sure. And it is a great question. I often feel with this one, for me, it's less about the discipline that someone comes from and more about their approach to research and almost their personality, their willingness to be open and try new things and engage with sort of humility and value what others are saying. So, you know, the Temperature Lives project wasn't a deep dive into climate science. You know, there will be so much that Alan still knows and understands about that world that I don't, and things that I know from my discipline that he doesn't. That sort of wasn't the point of this particular project, to try and get those things together, but it was just valuing different ways doing things and not being precious of like, oh, but this is how we do it and this is the only way. You know, that is for me what underpins this kind of work. So it's not so much choose your disciplines carefully, it's choose your people carefully for this sort of project to work.
So a kind of orientation, a way of thinking about the world, a way of being.
Absolutely, yeah.
Caleb, Alan, Kirk, any other things to add where you feel like this is kind of, these would be our top tips for doing sort of these radical interdisciplinary projects?
Yeah,
I think I'd add, oh, go on, Alan, you go for it.
Yeah, I suppose I'd sort of quickly replied in the chat, and it kind of basically what Cassie was saying there, like there's quite a lot of trust that goes in, and I imagine there's a lot of my colleagues in you know, physical geographers and that, and just wouldn't be interested in doing this. Like it does take a lot of trust, I think, from my part to think this is going to be worth my time to do it, because it's not immediately obvious before you set out how poetry will necessarily add like depth to very numeric climate data. So I feel like, yeah, it just takes a team with an open mind, and I really respect that the rest of the team, and like Caleb, I feel like Caleb really tore into the graphs at times, which I think is quite a, you know, potentially quite a brave thing to do in a country and a society that's so science focused, you know, and science is so often seen as like, you know, like a really important discipline, just to get stuck in and like, as the other said, like kind of poke fun at the graphs. Like do an interview with a graph is just such a ridiculous thing to do, and yeah, it definitely requires an open mind. And I've explained it to some of my colleagues in geography, and they're like, why? They're probably not the best person to try this project with, if that's their initial reaction.
And could I, just to continue that thought, I think that generosity and openness, which is partly, about people as much as the disciplines, is really like a bit like a buffet. You know, like we're all bringing some things to the buffet and going to share them. And, and I think Brigstow has that sense of generosity as well. And I enjoyed that, the process of working with Brigstow too, within this project. It felt like the right place for it. So yeah, like openness and humor and humility, really important, because if you're coming in with that kind of unspoken, I never got a sense there was a block. And sometimes you talk to people who work in the hard sciences, inverted commas, and there will be a bit about, oh, poetry, but I never had that sense at all. So I think keeping that kind of flow of skills and which is a generosity, I think.
And kind of links back to something I think that Josh said about not working with a kind of hypothesis model, but a much more kind of open exploratory model of kind of a kind of openness, which feels like, you know, is kind of classifies, I think, or characterizes both of these projects. That there feels like this kind of real openness to explore a set of questions, like a shared set of questions, but then a sort of openness about methods and approaches that feels really interesting. Kirk, anything to add? Like I don't know what your reflections, your kind of top tips would be to to those who are interested in doing interdisciplinary research, especially this radical kind of interdisciplinary research?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that this is a tip per se, so much as I don't know, a reflection or a distillation of this whole project. And listening to what people are saying, it seems that, you know, to me, it feels like there's a bit of an ethics. We keep sort of talking about humility and trust and listening, and perhaps listening as an ethic, as a methodology, I think is really quite important, because I think that there's also a politics to that above and beyond our, like, the group itself, right? That there's a politics to thinking about like where knowledge is produced, that knowledge is not necessarily produced, you know, in an academic space and then disseminated, that knowledge is actually sort of being produced in a disseminated sort of way across the social landscape. And listening to that has, you know, a certain kind of ethics to it. And I think that that's really important to see happening in a project like this. And so I really appreciate it.
And that's interesting. Rosanna's in the chat has just kind of captured a little bit of a sense of what she's hearing here. But I think it's interesting what you talk about, Kirk, because in a sense you're saying, and I think a lot of you are saying, so this is something more than a kind of like a checklist of do this and do that. But there is this kind of much more sort of ethical set of ideas. There's some kind of more profound ethical things, that power is a part of the story. I mean, like, you're using words like humility, which are words that often aren't used in the academy, that they're not the kind of, it's not a word that's used very often within the university context, or maybe in lots of places within society. And yet actually that's one of the words that it feels like you're talking about as a kind of really core part. A lot of the words of the work, and something that Hind has picked up on, and I think Alan, you talked about, is the kind of the politics of disciplines within the academy, and certain disciplines, the kind of the pecking order of disciplines, with the graph at the top and the poem at the bottom, or the kind of knowledge claims of the graph and quantitative science. And in some ways, one of the things that's really interesting about your project is that kind of repositioning. I mean, I don't know, maybe any reflections on this? Is interdisciplinary research, radically interdisciplinary research, always about redistributing power? You know, like Kirk is suggesting, there's a kind of ethics to it. Is it always a kind of insertion into a world that positions power one way and kind of repositions that? I don't know whether any of you would make that claim or felt that, like, were you messing with power at moments here? Hind?
I think at some point it was stepping down from what you know and being more open to what you don't know, which is always a good point in any type of research. Because you might get on your high horse, or, for example, if you know something that's mathematically true, but you haven't looked at the meaning or application to how to use that, then it's not something that's useful. I also draw a lot from, we're looking now at where disciplines are sort of converging a bit more, but if you look into the late 1700s, early 1800s, when the science was called natural philosophy, and the disciplines were actually just starting to divulge, there's a poet called Samuel Coleridge, who was really fighting against the fact of not using poetry was wrong. Because when they invented the hot air balloon, they described it as the first person who saw the sunset twice, which is a lot more interesting to the greater population. I don't know if you've tried to struggle through any mathematical text or engineering text, and even if you're in the field, it's dry. So I think there's a huge benefit in not talking like that, if I can say that. Might put some backs up there, but.
Yeah, I think you won't put Caleb's back up. Caleb's just put in the chat about the kind of value of fooling, of a kind of poking fun. But I think Alan was someone humble enough to take that poking and that fooling around with the graphs that he devotes his life to. Hind, I know you've got your hand up. Do you want to ask a question or make a comment?
I just want, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Yes. Perfectly.
Because I'm not in the UK and the internet here is not very good. One of the things I think I want to reflect on is, as an engineer, and I have been long enough to be able to say that, usually we stay to our environment, to our hard science, which we stay in the same, sometimes in the same building, and I don't know if it is because of comfort or because of the pressure, I don't know. But anyway, we want to, and we have too much we think we have too much to give to the students. So we stick to the hard science. And for me, one thing that I learned from COVID is the fact that by having a lot of different people organizing seminars, organizing video conferencing, and mainly interdisciplinaries, really has opened my eyes really to all the things. You know, it's not just because I was teaching the build environment and my research subject is on renewable energies and sustainability. And when I used to teach the subject, it was really how to measure humidity, how to measure temperature, how to improve the comfort of the building and everything. And finally, you discover that is not the most important thing. There is other things. And then, of course, also I teach natural ventilation, natural lighting. And now I begin to look at, of course, sustainability, renewable energy, carbon zero, you know, that we don't bring materials from very far because we want to build a house, how we can. And so that really has given us that to begin really listening to people who are poets, which in the past for us, it was a waste of time, and listening to other subject and discipline. And for me, it has really been eye-opening.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Like one thing that's really striking there is that in some ways, this kind of hybrid space that we operate in now is potentially a space that pulls us out of some of our physical silos into a set of different kinds of interactions. Alan, let's maybe give you the last word. We gave you the first word, so we should also give you the last word. And you've been poked fun at by Caleb the poet, and so we'd love to give you a final word.
Sure. Well, actually, I was just going to reflect on what Hans said there, that, you know, this, for me, this project came out of an online conference event. It was one of the ones, it's a conference called Communicate. It used to be held at Bristol Zoo, and the Cabot Institute had funded free tickets to people to go along. And at that, I saw a session that Cassie was chairing and Cliff was involved. And it just was like the little, you know, the starting point for where all these ideas came together. And I reached out to Cliff and we had a discussion, and this is where it all went from. And I just think, you know, looking back at the story of how, for me, this project unfolded and all these little things that led to it, it's quite remarkable, I think, to see how it all kind of came to fruition in the end. So I think it's really good that these kinds of online fora exist for people to have these discussions and to get new ideas. And if you see someone you thought was interesting in this call, fire them a message afterwards, and I suppose you never know what might happen.
That's great. The genesis, the beginning of your project was an online space, and so it's maybe appropriate that we reflect on it a little bit in an online space. Pete's put in the link to the project that Pete and Josh and Jameson and Sabina have been working on, so you'll be able to follow up more and find out a lot more on their website. And do keep glued to the Brigstow page to find out a bit more about Alan, Caleb, Kirk, Cassie and Cliff's project, because there'll be more coming up there very soon to find out more about the kind of things that have emerged from the workshopping. And Gail's also put in the link. There's some resources that we've been developing at Brigstow, which are some toolkits to help people at different stages of interdisciplinary and co-produced projects that really try and tease out some of the kind of bigger ethical questions that Kirk mentioned about how to be a good interdisciplinary researcher, and the kinds of attitudes or kind of approaches. But we should say a huge thank you to all of you for sharing these two projects that were operating side by side. And in some ways, we're exploring some kind of similar things about how people feel about the world. And thank you as well for asking those much bigger questions around interdisciplinarity. And how we do that better and why we might do that. And one thing I think that's been really lovely is I think all of you conveyed a sense of the joy of learning from others and of being involved in these projects that are projects that have really kind of brought much to you. So thanks all. I think we should close off now. I'm sorry for running 4 minutes late. Hope that all of you have a great rest of the day. It's going to be cold out there, but I guess that might feel different to all of us. Take care. Bye now.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah.